Hello, folks. John Lee here. I hope you're doing well. This is a November 20th update on the I-5 Interstate Bridge project. What we are seeing is a multifaceted collapse of transportation and transportation-related issues here in the Portland metro area, in Oregon, and in Washington state. The IBR, the I-5 Interstate Bridge Replacement project, has seen two of three main dominoes fall most recently. Greg Johnson, the program administrator, is resigned effective the end of the year. ODOT's Director Kris Strickler has announced he's leaving. Only WashDOT's Julie Meredith remains, but she only took over 9 to 10 months ago. So there's a lack of experienced, knowledgeable leadership at the top. The several other aspects of the project are also in turmoil, especially related to ODOT, as multiple program leaders for the Rose Quarter project and many other projects that are quote unquote mega projects have departed and leaving the agency in chaos. In the big picture here, the IBR program only has to please the ODOT director and the WashDOT directors. It appears Greg Johnson has lost the trust of ODOT and WashDOT directors and therefore announced his sudden departure here roughly a month ago. An additional big picture backdrop in all of this. Recently, the Oregon governor called an emergency session of the legislature to move through a $4.3 billion transportation tax package. That got passed, but barely, only after 2 months of wrangling. And now Oregon citizens are on the verge of collecting enough signatures to put the $4.3 billion transportation tax package on the ballot for November of 2026. And what that would do is it would immediately pause the $4.3 billion tax package, $430 million a year, that ODOT was expecting to get and to be able to spend. Therefore, a huge number of tough choices are underway at ODOT. Related to that citizen initiative, after just 3 days of collecting signatures, they had collected over 42,000 signatures. They only need 78,000. So clearly they're going to get enough signatures, put that on the ballot. And as soon as that is verified, the state of Oregon is required to pause collecting any of those transportation dollars. So that's a huge problem. A different aspect in the backdrop of all of this is that last year in June, at the tail end of the Oregon legislature, the legislator took $251 million from Oregon's general fund and allocated that to the Interstate Bridge project. Under the agreements between the two states and the program, Oregon still owes $500 million, $250 million in 2027, and an additional $250 million in 2029 to the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. And that is before we get an updated cost, which supposedly is going to be provided to the public and legislators in December. Think of this a different way. That $251 million would have provided a ton of money for maintenance and preservation work in Oregon transportation projects, not to mention the reality of other general fund priorities. So that was diverted towards the I-5 bridge, and none of that had to go there, but the Democrat Party, the leaders and those in control of the Oregon legislature ultimately took $251 million of the people's money and put it towards the IBR. And most likely, they're going to go pick another $250 million from the general fund in 2027 and an additional $250 million in 2029 because their ODOT is broke. Their transportation spending is all wrong. And therefore, what are they going to do? Where's the money going to come from? Well, once we get the updated cost of the IBR in December, Most likely, one of the things that will be revealed is an increase of $1 to $2 billion, maybe more, bringing the total price tag for the project between $9 and $10 billion. Number one. My guess is that the IBR will say they are going to have to increase the amount borrowed in order to help fund the never-ending increasing cost of the IBR. They will increase it from the current $1.25 billion to $2.5 billion. They're going to double the amount of borrowing that has to be paid back by tolling. And therefore, what the people can expect is the amount of the tolls are going to have to double in order to pay back double the amount of money that they borrow from Wall Street. Let's talk additional facets of the problems at the IBR. They are multiple years behind schedule, and there are serious questions as to whether or not they'll get a record of decision by next summer, which would then allow the first shovels to go in the ground by the end of September. And there are multiple facets of that. But bottom line, if they don't get shovels in the ground by the end of September, they likely lose federal money for the project. Currently, there's $2.1 billion of federal money allocated to the project, and the program was hoping for an additional $1 billion. But looking at multiple facets of this, number one, on being behind schedule, the U.S. Coast Guard has to approve their request to build a bridge too low, or to just simply issue a permit in order to build a bridge over the Columbia River. Just this past week, it was revealed that the IBR has negotiated $140 million in what Lars Larson has called bribes to 4 upriver firms in order to be allowed to build that bridge too low. The Coast Guard does not have to give approval for that. And if the Coast Guard says, no, we are sticking with our demand that you build at least a bridge offering 178 feet of clearance, then the program is going to pivot and say, we're going to try to move forward with a bridge with a lift span in it that gives the 178 feet the Coast Guard is demanding. But another problem of that is that that will add at least $500 million to the price tag of the whole project. And number two, while the program has said they've been doing designing, the reality is most of the design work has been related to the 116-foot clearance fixed span bridge as opposed to the movable span bridge, and therefore they will get further behind. Another facet of being behind is the NEPA process. The environmental process requires the program to respond to the 10,000 plus citizen comments and questions made a year ago. And the IBR has not published those responses. They haven't finished answering those responses. Once they finish that, then they provide those responses to the federal government, and the federal government will review all 10,000 citizen comments as well as the IBR's answers. That's going to take a boatload of time. Some people optimistically say, well, they can get it done in 6 months. I'm skeptical of that. And others that have followed this process for many, many, many years are saying it's going to take close to a year for the federal government to review that many citizen comments and questions. Bottom line, it pushes the whole project out well beyond the 30 September deadline, and therefore that likely triggers the loss of federal funding if no construction is started by September 30th. Right now, the program has $2.1 billion in federal dollars, and one grant requires shovels in the ground by September 30th. The second one, that is also a milestone that the federal government is going to look at, and if they failed there, the federal government most likely pulls all the money. So in the big picture, the IBR remains a light rail project in search of a bridge. That's what's driving the low 160-foot clearance for marine traffic on the Columbia River. That in turn gives us a max light rail station 90 feet above the ground at the Vancouver waterfront and perhaps 50, maybe 60 feet above the ground at Hayden Island. Nobody's going to want to use light rail stops that high above the ground. You might get a very, very small handful of people there that use it. They're going to have very complicated elevators or escalator systems, all of which add to the cost of this. And it's a ridiculous aspect of the current proposed design. Separate from all of this, TriMet is having its own collapse. It should be in bankruptcy. Layoffs just were announced this last week, and they are talking about, on the surface, $300 million in annual cuts to their operating costs. And so let's talk about that for a sec. What is their operating budget? TriMet most recent approval in their operating budget was about $900 million. So $300 million is a third of their operating budget. So they're going to have to gut a third of their operations. They're talking about cutting 18% of max light rail service and potentially up to a quarter of their bus service. So clearly that gutting and reorganization of TriMet is going to be an unbelievable impediment to the IBR and its ability to convince the federal government that they can actually operate the proposed IBR project. Different aspect of this, but it's still important, is TriMet's current fare box recovery, i.e. the passenger fares that people that ride the buses and the light rail only covers 8% of all operating costs. That's down from about 34% just over a decade ago. So that is not a viable financial organization. It's not a healthy business model for the federal government to approve the overall project, number one. Number two, the IBR recently released updated transit ridership projections. The citizens on both sides of the river have been questioning the IBR's ridership projections that was made roughly 3 years ago. And they just cut those ridership projections by 84%. On one level, that's an outrage that they were allowed to mislead the public and legislators 2.5 to 3 years ago on that projected ridership. And the current new ridership numbers between 4,500 and 5,400 riders a day, I believe that is still incredibly optimistic when the current C-Tran bus ridership is around 525 passengers a day on C-Tran's express buses into Portland, and total C-Tran ridership is around 1,000 riders a day crossing the Columbia River. So there's no way, with ridership over the Columbia River having stagnated for 3 years, that it's likely you're going to see 4,000 to 5,000 riders on the IBR. Therefore, looking at this honestly, you can say the evaluation of the whole project should cut the $2 billion transit component from the entire $7.5 billion cost of the IBR. That's over a quarter of the price tag that could and should be gone, and that's what ought to happen. It's not going to happen if Greg Johnson's team has anything to say about it, because the Portland special interests are demanding light rail be part of it. Light rail is not needed. They're looking at it as a way to throw some bonus money to TriMet to try and keep them alive just a little bit longer. A different facet of this is that TriMet has told the Federal Transit Administration that at the end of 2024, they had 40 surplus light rail vehicles. 40% of their light rail fleet are surplus. Therefore, there is zero need for the program to buy any new light rail vehicles. And TriMet told the IBR project that they wanted $190 to $290 million to buy 19 light rail vehicles. None of them are needed, and that also saves costs. Different facet of this, ODOT, as I mentioned before, huge funding problems on existing transportation projects. Very, very rough wag is $3 billion to $4 billion or more today is needed to finish current projects on the book since their last transportation package was passed in HB 2017, 8 years ago. The I-5 Rose Quarter project, perhaps $1.5 billion underfunded. Number two, the I-205 Abernathy Bridge, it's 80 to 90% complete, but they still don't have the money to finish paying for that. And that is supposed to be completed in 2026. Other projects around the state, ODOT doesn't have the money. An important one of those is the Hood River White Salmon Bridge project that is just starting, slowly moving forward, but they have roughly $1 billion in a funding shortfall that both Oregon and Washington and the federal government are going to have to find money in order to pay for that. But right now, that's a huge, huge funding problem for transportation between both the states. Finally, I want to close out by letting you know about a recently revealed outrage. WSP was hired by Greg Johnson as the primary consultant for the IBR project. And that's a problem multiple ways. Number one, Greg Johnson used to work for WSP, the consultant, and therefore he hired his own boss, his old firm, to now get paid to oversee not the IBR, number one. Number two, you, the people, ought to know WSP is the consultant on the Rose Quarter project. It's the consultant on the I-205 Abernathy project. It's the consultant in Washington State on 405 projects and a whole host of things. So there's huge conflicts of interest with regard to WSP being there. But the outrage is that in the contract WashDOT signed with WSP and the IBR, WSP is guaranteed a 32% profit. Your tax dollars paying 32% of everything they bill to pure bottom line profit at WSP. It's truly an outrageous picking of the taxpayer's pocket. There's an article at clarkcountytoday.com that gets more into the details, but it is ridiculous and it's a ripoff of you, the tax-paying people. Final nugget on this. So far, the IBR has reported spending of $235 million of the people's money through June of 2025. WSP got $196 million of that $235 million. That's 83% of all IBR spending was funneled through WSP. That's an outrageous ripoff of you, the taxpayers, in our nation, in the state of Oregon, and in the state of Washington. So that's what I've got for now. Stay tuned. Keep reading the news. Clark County Today is your best source of information related to the I-5 bridge. It's got the most thorough coverage of all the issues related to it. But thanks so much, with much, much more to follow.